Hi, everybody. What is going on? Happy Friday. It's Grade School Friday. It's a good day. I hope everybody's doing great. I hope you can see me. I hope you can hear me. I hope technology is on my side. I don't really quite know how to explain to you guys, like, I've shared with you before, Grade School Friday is like a highlight of my week for sure. Like, I wake up in a good mood on Friday mornings because I know it's grade school day. Like, I really enjoy it. But at the same time, like, Grade School Friday, like what we're doing right now, it's just me in my room where I always am during the workday. It's just a normal day. So there's this very sort of like odd anxiety that overtakes me right before I hit the button to go live and start talking to you guys. You know, like those nightmares that you would have about showing up to school without any pants on? Maybe I was the only one who had that nightmare. I feel like that's a pretty common collective cultural nightmare, like showing up for work or school without being properly dressed and suited for the occasion. It's kind of like that type of anxiety that grips me right before I hit the button. I'm like, wait, like I could be like, because I also come, like trudging in here at whatever time I get ready to start working in the morning, and I've got a cup of coffee and I'm wearing sweatpants or whatever. Like, it's not a super formal space here most of the time. So there's a little bit of anxiety that grips me every time I press the button. I'm like, wait, am I like wearing clothes? Am I able to speak? Like, am I ready for broadcasting my little tiny corner of the west side of Los Angeles out to the world? So I hope so. It looks like I'm wearing clothes. I feel like I'm in decent shape there, but I just thought I'd share that little tidbit with you guys. I hope you guys are doing great. We're going to have a really good session today. I'm really excited about today's topic, color separation. You guys have heard me talk about this topic in a lot of different contexts. I think color separation is the answer to so many questions that we have when we're color grading. What's the problem here? Color separation. Why isn't saturation working better for me? Color separation. There's all these different questions that can feel totally unrelated that actually have an answer of color separation in some form. So I'm really excited about our session. I want to do a question that came in the comments this week that I thought was a really good one that I thought we could kick things off with. So let's get started with that. By the way, my buddy Gadali's here with me. At least I hope he's here with me. Are you with me, Gadali?
I'm last I checked, I'm here. I'm still here. I'm also wearing clothes,
Okay,
but
good.
you can't see me, so it doesn't really
Good.
matter.
So it didn't matter. And you can vouch for me that I am fully clothed and I don't have a booger hanging out of my nose or anything like that as I've now begun grade school. Although I guess, can you see me? You can only see me in the future, can't you?
I am seeing the YouTube stream, and I see that you're clothed from the waist up at least,
Yeah.
so we're good.
At least as of, well, no, you only see me as I was in the past, in the very recent past, technically,
True.
as is true for all of you guys. So in this moment, who knows what's happening in the present moment that you are watching this, but the few moments prior that you are watching me broadcast from,
Anything can
all,
happen.
all is going well. I don't know why I get such a kick out of this, like, very simple mechanism of there being a little bit of a lag to a live stream, but boy, I get a lot of mileage out of that just in personal chuckles. All right, let's talk about some color grading. Let's party. Okay, so here's a question that came in from my guy Joe. So here's the question. What is your approach to color separation when you are working with scenes that are cool in the highlights? For example, Scandinavian overcast exteriors or fluorescent lab interiors. So this is a really cool question, and I kind of want to see if I have a shot that kind of fits that description. Let's look at some resolve here. By the way, can you hear my daughter, guys? She's getting big. She's getting loud. I think I might need to get an office, like an actual office, not trick out my garage. As much as I love working in here, working from home, I hear they don't get quieter. Can anyone vouch for me? Any parents out there? Do they get quieter as they get older? I don't think so. Okay, let's see if we can find a shot here. So cool in the highlights. I mean, I kind of got these things that I think are a decent example of that. So let's just look at one of these shots as a good example. Oh, if we want the ultimate counter example of not cool in the highlights, I think we found our candidate. But let's go with one of these guys. So I'm going to go with this. So here's a shot that I think is actually a pretty good example. So just getting a little bit of context in place for us. What are we looking at here? We're color managed in our normal stock DaVinci Wide Gamut color management settings. So how do we go about getting color separation when we're cool in the highlights? So here's what I would say to answer this question, but also just in general about color separation. This is something I tried to emphasize in this week's video, but I'll re-emphasize here. Color separation is about spotting and seizing opportunities. And there are going to be lots of opportunities in the course of grading up an image that are going to go by you. Some of them you're going to be smart enough and paying good enough attention to grab. And some of those you're going to be skilled enough to take really good advantage of. Okay. So color separation is all about seizing upon opportunities, regardless of what the shot is. So if you have a shot in which the highlights are cooler, where you have cooler accents in the high end, is one thing we could definitely say about this image. And in general, if we look at our vector scope, there's nothing, we don't have a particularly strong upper left quadrant, which is typically what we would think of as the warm quadrant, right? So that's the general character of the image. But the trick here, as with any shot, is going to be to seize upon the opportunities that we have within it. So let's just kind of play some jazz here for a second. I'm just going to work things sort of on an individual shot level. I'm going to start by adding some contrast. And if I was doing, my normal node tree, short answer here, we could start with our basics. Maybe we do want to do a look. I started with that contrast, but I now want to go in and look at, we could do something from Voyager, maybe from the Essentials pack, just to make things kind of quick. And actually, I just broke my own rule. I started grading without having a look underneath, and lo and behold, it doesn't work with the look turned on there. So fundamentally, if we look at some of these looks, just because they are themselves doing cool shadows, warm highlights, doesn't mean they can't work on images that have cool highlights. So, finding a good look is still a very applicable piece of advice that's going to get us, when you find the right one, some good color separation right out the box. I actually really like, I like Nirvana and Mutara in different ways, but let's go with Nirvana. And I'm just going to scale back my key output gain a little bit so it's not quite so strong. So that's already pretty good. And then if we look at the image itself here, it's really just a matter of seizing on what I'm seeing here. And one thing that I would emphasize is the biggest color contrast or the most common type of color contrast that you're going to find and want to exploit when you're color grading is going to be skin against something, right? That could be a cooler shadow, that could be a sky, that could be some cooler wardrobe or art direction, that could be a cooler highlight or accent in the high end of the image, as Joe's question alluded to. So in this case, I happen to have kind of cooler shadows and cooler highlights, but I'm getting, first of all, just with the look, I'm getting some better contrast between skin and the rest of the scene. So anything that you can think about it this way, whether you're asking about cool highlights or cool shadows or cool midtones or cool anything, cool is always going to have good color contrast against skin. Skin is in most of our images. So that right there, anytime you ask me, how do you get color contrast when there's something cool in the frame? I'm like, well, that's actually pretty easy. I think what can be trickier is getting color contrast when there are warm things in the frame, because we're always going to have something warm in the frame, generally speaking. We're always going to have people who are going to have hues that are living up here in this upper left-hand side. So anything cool, in my book, is an opportunity for color contrast. What gets a little bit trickier is when you're a little more starved for cool elements. But I guess I would say fundamentally, this, by the way, is not a question that I put great thought into, but when I was looking through comments this morning, it stood out to me as a good one to cover. I would say, as we're sort of taking a lap through this here together, if it's cool, then you're going to first attempt would probably be, well, see if you can create some contrast between that and your subject's skin, right? And then other than that, kind of the same playbook underneath. Let's optimize our exposure. Let me hide this LUTs folder for you guys so it's a little bit easier to see this. Optimize our exposure, optimize our contrast, and then optimize our color balance as well. And these are the opportunities that I'm hopefully seizing well right now. I'm not they're more just opportunities that I'm intuitively spotting and hopefully taking good advantage of. So right now I'm just trying to kind of max out that separation with my balance. And that makes me kind of want to go back and trim in my exposure a little bit. Honestly, I feel like just doing that little trim of exposure and contrast and having that look there, that feels like some nice color contrast in this image where we felt pretty flat, pretty boring beforehand. So that's what I would say, and I think Joe's comment was specific to cool in the highlights, Scandinavian overcast exteriors or fluorescent lab interiors. So it sounds like those might be scenarios where you are indeed working with a more washed type of scenario. So maybe to round out the answer to this question here, I would say if you're talking about an image with a predominant amount of cool stuff in it, whether that's cool highlights or cool highlights and other cool things like am seeing in my mind's eye when I imagine a Scandinavian day exterior, the go-to there, I think the first thing I would look to would be, do I have people in the frame who I can create color contrast with? If not people, is there anything warm in the frame that I can create some color contrast with? And if you don't, the other reason I thought this was a good question to cover is like, you're going to have frames that are just dominant in one quadrant of your vector scope. You know, like there's a couple in this timeline here, like these two, I can tell you from experience, I actually can move them enough that I get some color balance or color contrast, I should say, spanning my quadrants. But you're going to have certain images that don't present much or any opportunity to create color contrast. And the best that you can do in those situations is recognize that, you know, like I've had, I'll put it this way, when I do black and white grades, which comes up from from time to time with clients, who are like, hey, we want to turn the whole thing black and white. We want to grade it that way. I welcome that. I've really enjoyed doing black and white grades, but I also just clock in my sort of inventory and my toolkit, what am I going to throw at this project? What are my go-tos? What are my options for grading this project? I just sort of make the mental note that I'm like, all right, I'm going to have to find other ways to create contrast and separation because color is off the table. And that's actually something I want to touch more on today is the different ways we can think about creating color or creating contrast in general in our images. But that's kind of final note there. If you're looking at an image that is truly devoid of hues that are living in more than one vector, and it's not just a question of teasing those out with your balance, then I would say embrace that and then look at going more with the washy type of look, maybe increase that color in that quadrant and then find a way to create contrast or what we could call separation using other means than with color. Hope that helps. Let's see what questions we got out there. What do you guys want to know?
Question from I go by Zach Q. Are there shots you would advise against pushing color separation, like a monochromatic set design?
Yeah, you know, I'm glad you asked that. I think we sort of touched on that at the end of this prior question. You always want to be working with a shot. And, you know, like I talk about this a lot when it comes to working with reference images, for example. What you want to do if your client brings you a reference image, and I'm sure many of us can relate to this situation where, you know, your client has shot their project and they bring you Blade Runner or No Country for Old Men as their reference, and there's just not that many similar visual characteristics between their project and the one they're using as their reference. So the best thing you can do in those scenarios is figure out, all right, what does relate, what does connect, and how can I borrow that in a way that supports this image? Because whether we're talking about working with reference images or just the grade in general, we want to make this is I think a useful way to lens color grading. Really what we're trying to do when we color grade is to make our image look the most like itself that we can. Does that sound kind of silly? One of my favorite like little quips that I think is sometimes attributed to Eisenhower, but who knows where it came from originally. But there's that great quote of like, well, it's more the way now than it's ever been. That's kind of the thing with like color grading. It's like, that's actually my goal. I'm actually thinking about that when I'm color grading. I'm trying to make this image look most like itself, look the most like itself that I possibly can. I don't want to bend it or push it in some direction. So of course, the reason I mention all this is if there's very low color contrast innate in the design of the shot, as you mentioned, production design, art direction, wardrobe, overall sort of composition don't seem to indicate that they were going for color contrast. In fact, maybe it indicates the opposite. Maybe they wanted more of a monochrome thing. We need to be sensitive to that as artists, and we need to support that. And in fact, we need to advocate for that. Sometimes that's one of our most important roles when we're color grading, is to hold a mirror up to our clients and say, hey, it looks to me like you did a very good job of designing a shot with a very low color contrast color scheme or color palette. Let's lean into that. Let's not try to rewrite your shot here in post. Let's lean into what you did really well and find a way to make your image the best form of itself, not a really poor form of someone else's image. So I hope that's some helpful ideas there.
There were several people asking about color separation and sort of monochromatic grades, which you touched on a little bit. It seems like worth expanding upon.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's talk about monochromatic grades and separation within those and how we pull that off. So this kind of touches on a theme that I wanted to tease out in our discussion today because we didn't get to fully cover it in this past week's video. Here's the way that it's helpful to think about contrast when we're color grading, period. And I'm going to use the words contrast and separation sort of interchangeably. Like separate the word contrast from like a knob or a, like crunchy shadows or thin shadows or whatever. And just think about contrast as the delta between two things, the difference between two things, like if you contrast like, I don't know, my morning routine with that of my wife, they're very different. There is high contrast between the way that we start our days for a variety of reasons. Like think of any example. That's what I mean when I say contrast in this case. That's generally what I mean when I say contrast and color grading. So when I say separation, hopefully that makes it clear that those are really the same thing. We're just talking about distinguishing, articulating, separating two elements and how well defined, how obviously separate they are. So that's what we mean when we talk about separation or contrast in any sense, whether we're talking about color separation or separation along some other axis, which is what I'm getting to right now. And the idea with all of that is that what we are trying to do is make an image more legible. To say like, okay, well, there's that, and there's that. And they stand out to me. They pop out to me. They read to me really, really fast. This is something that's really helpful to keep in mind when we're grading images. An image that reads faster to the viewer looks better to the viewer. That's an image that the viewer is going to go, wow, that's really beautiful, because it's easier on their brain to synthesize, to process what's happening in that image. Okay. So all this is sort of precursor, backdrop to this idea of separation or contrast, one dimension of which we are talking about today and this week, which is color separation. But here's how I want you to think about separation in general and how to find and exploit it and max it out when we are color grading. Separation is something we always want and need when we're color grading. An image that has no separation, no contrast of any sort is not a good image. It's a matter of how you are going to get it into the image. One great way would be tonal contrast. That's like the basic type of contrast that I alluded to a minute ago when I was saying I'm talking about something bigger than that. Tonal contrast is simply increasing the distance between, for example, shadows and highlights, or decreasing the distance between shadows and highlights. Okay? So that would be one form of contrast. Another form of contrast, this is the form that we were talking about this week, color contrast, where the hues in our vectorscope have high separation, high distinction between one another. So we looked at many examples of that. We looked at how something as simple as, if I look at this image, by the time I, let's grab a still here. By the time I throw a look on and just do a balance, I will have gone from rather low color separation to rather high color separation. Low color sep, high color sep. And you can even see that predicted in the vectorscope, because now my vectorscope is touching more than one quadrant down here, where before it's pretty much confined to one quadrant. Okay, so that's a second form of introducing separation. We can also, and that can, we can look at creating separation with overall contrast. We can look at creating separation with overall color balance. And then we can also look at articulating individual things, individual elements. So one thing that I'm driving toward when it comes to black and white, you guys have heard me talk about this before, but if we look at if you want a simple upgrade, actually we should do a video on this. This would be a really good video. But if you want a simple upgrade to grading black and white, let's look at this image. So I've thrown this look on here. Let's leave this look on here. Let's say we really, really like it. I'm going to do a different one maybe. And now I'm just going to go over here and drop my saturation to 0. That would be kind of like the go-to way of creating or of doing a black and white grade on a color image, which I mentioned a moment ago. That's something that comes up all the time. I actually want to do it on this image because there's a few more colors and things going on in here for the demonstration I want to make. So if you want a simple upgrade to grading your black and white image. If we grab a still of this, instead of just setting your sat knob to 0, we can go over here to our friend, the RGB mixer, and go to monochrome mode here, like so. And now we can look at creating separation, in a sense, color separation, even though there is no color in this image. So I can change the relative weight of my red, my green, and my blue in this image. And can you see that if I'm looking at this through the lens of what is a trio of slider positions, which nets me the easiest task of reading all the different object surfaces and colors in this frame? That's essentially, that could be one way that I decide, okay, great, Cullen, so you told me to use the RGB mixer in monochrome mode and move the sliders around. Well, how do I decide what's good or bad? Of course, you can just go by instinct and intuition and go by what your eye tells you, but you can also go through and look at, where am I finding the easiest ability to discern all of the unique colors and objects and surfaces in this frame? That's a great way of creating separation in your image. And that, I guess, in a sense, is color separation, but really that falls into the category of, like what we could call color density, maybe. We're looking at how do we separate colors out from one another by raising or lowering their intensity, by raising or lowering their luminance, for lack of a better term. Okay, so that's related to the color separation that we were talking about this week, but it's unique, and it really has a place definitely in monochrome work. But even if we're not going full tilt with this, because check this out, if we were just going to go with more of a washed look, so let's say we're going to only do the monochrome mixer at 50% or at maybe 30%, and maybe upstream, I'm just kind of making stuff up here, maybe upstream, we're going to go for like a cool push, like so. So we're getting into more of a monochrome territory here, and I'm actually even going to go harder on this RGB mixer intensity. So low saturation, very washy, right? But we can still apply the same principle. Here in the RGB mixer, where am I getting more or less separation in this image when I modulate my red, green, and blue sliders with the RGB mixer in monochrome mode? So I think that is sort of like your first line of defense. If you're talking about black and white or even just a washy, more monochrome image, one of your first lines of defense is figuring out, okay, since I don't have the color of these objects that is going to allow them to distinguish themselves from one another, can I distinguish one from the other by changing their respective luminance or brightness or value or density, whatever term you want to use? I'm being loose in my usage of those words here today. But point being, can I create distinction between these various objects and surfaces, not by relying on the fact that they have different hues, because that's a very low delta in a scenario like this, but instead by manipulating them such that they have different intensity or luminance. And by the way, if you want to get a really good sense for how this works and get great examples of this, go look at movies before black and white really went out of style, or any great black and white film. Black and white DPs understood this. Black and white DPs and directors, for that matter, and production designers, like all the creative stakeholders in a black and white production, on when black and white was done well, they understood how to look at the image in black and white and say like, well, that's all good and well that right now I can discern very easily between, say, like this pot and I'm trying to like get an example of two objects that are sort of stacked up, between, like this plant and the wall behind it, but those are kind of going to become the same thing once I'm looking at the black and white image. So how can I create separation with those things based on value, based on density, based on luminance, as opposed to hue, because I won't have that tool in my toolkit for creating separation if I'm shooting a black and white film. So go back and look at some black and white movies if you want to see some really ingenious ways of creating separation using light, using value of different objects and surfaces in the frame in order to create that high separation, which, again, to put a big bow on all of this. Separation in some form is a must when we're color grading. You must have separation. If you don't have separation, you're making your viewer work too hard to read the image. Working too hard to read the image is not fun. It's one of the first cues that we get as a viewer that makes us go, that's not a compelling image. That's a boring image. That's an image that I'm not interested in. So we want to make an image that's legible. We want to make an image that has high separation in whatever form we're able to introduce it.
John is wondering, aside from making a more pleasing image, what are the foundational aims when creating color separation?
I think that might be it.
Oh, did you not? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you. No,
okay.
I actually think that's my answer to John's question.
I got it.
It's a really good question, and I would say, like if we look at things, you could look at things a little bit through the lens of like color correction, and you could say that, for example, I don't know all of the details with this shot that we were looking at before, but when this shot comes in, it's pretty clear to me that we've got either a miscalibrated camera or more likely a light source and a camera rating that don't agree with each other. So if the camera's rated for 3200, this light source must have been closer to 27 or 2600 Kelvin in order to get this orangey, like overly warm reproduction. Yeah, there's lots of warm stuff in the frame. Yeah, there's a prominent human subject which has a warm color to it innately, or has a warm color to her skin innately, but there's a mismatch here. So from a sort of color correction POV, you could say that color separation is something that, like, when we get a balanced image, a well-separated image is one that is probably balanced, put it that way. And an image that is not super well separated, maybe, it's not always the case, but an image with very low color separation is often an image that we have failed to properly balance, or that is in need of proper balance, if that makes sense. That's really the only addition that I would make there. Other than that, that's the pitch. That's the value prop of color separation, is it makes the image easier to read. Making an image easier to read is the easiest thing that we can do to make it pleasing. There's all kinds of different aesthetics and modes and vibes that we can be pursuing creatively when we're grading, but one that is pretty much a universal rule is higher separation is more legible and more pleasant to look at, and the viewer is going to respond favorably to it. Lower separation is less pleasant, more difficult to look at, and the viewer is probably going to respond either indifferently or by not liking what they're looking at. So that would be my best answer on that.
Corona is wondering, do you have any advice on using LAB space for color separation?
We've had the question come up about LAB a couple times recently, or we've had questions, I should say, come up about it. And to be honest with you, I don't use LAB very much when I'm grading, but every time we ask the question, I make a mental note and go, ooh, I got to play with that soon. And then I completely forget to do it. Let's play with LAB a little bit right now. So could we use LAB to come up with an interesting balance for this image underneath our look? Let's scale back the intensity of this look just a little bit. Let's give it a go. So here's what I'm going to do. This isn't the only way to go about this, but just for the sake of kind of making things clear, we're going to create a little sandwich. We're going to say 2 LAB, and then we're going to say 2 RGB. And on this side, we're going to go DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate, LAB, and I'm not even sure this is going to matter. I don't think it will. No. So let's just say LAB Linear. And now we're going to go from LAB Linear, DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate, no tone mapping, no gamut mapping, no OOTFs. And remember, whenever you're making round trips, first thing you want to check is that you've got a net zero round trip, because we want to go to an interesting place, do an interesting thing, and then go right back where we started. So until we do that interesting thing in the middle, we should see no difference in our image. All right, so in LAB, the LAB color model, for those who don't know, is a system in which you have 3 channels, L, A, and B, L is your luminance. L is your luminance channel. So there's no color in there at all. That's just your grayscale. So we've talked about this in the past in the context of like, if you want to add or remove contrast from your image without adjusting saturation, look at what happens when I adjust my contrast pivot and I look at the vectorscope. That signal mass is really not changing at all. That's very different than what happens if I crank contrast pivot in RGB. That signal mass is moving all over the place, right? So that's something that we can do in LAB. We can operate on that L channel because that's luminance only. But if we look at our A and our B, we can play around with our offsets potentially. So you can see the axis that A runs along. The A channel kind of runs along this green magenta axis as I move my offset. And the B channel moves along this kind of blue yellow axis, roughly speaking. So you could look at, you could almost do, like, here's what we're going to get to guinea pig this out together. This is something I've been meaning to play around with and I just haven't on my own time. So we're going to do it together. You could almost do contrast pivot on your A channel and on your B channel. So contrast is going to increase the delta, the separation of values on this axis, and pivot is going to change where that is anchored. So it's essentially a form of saturation. And then we could do the same thing down here. Increase our contrast and move our pivot until we're getting something interesting. And I'm just kind of eyeballing my vectorscope to see where my skin tone and the overall signal are landing to make sure that I like what I'm looking at. I'm just adjusting my pivot. So, I mean, that's kind of cool, I think. In this setting, basically what we're doing is we're saying, okay, all my separation is going to come either from my A channel or my B channel in the way I manipulate it. The contrast, if you're using my exact setup here of contrast pivot, the contrast knob, that is roughly speaking going to be your saturation in these directions. And on the B side, your contrast knob is going to be your saturation along this axis, roughly speaking. Your pivot will be the middle point of that expansion. So if you adjust it properly, you'll get the right amount pushing out toward magenta versus pushing toward green in the case of your A channel. And in the case of the B channel, you will get the right ratio of energy pushing out towards yellow versus energy pushing out towards blue. And that's something that may feel intuitive as I describe it to you. It may feel intuitive when you actually have it in your hands when you're grading, or it may not, but that could be a really fun thing to try. And that's kind of a pretty good initial bite or primer on LAB. It's basically a luminance channel and then two color difference channels. And once I've got this dialed in and I've kind of set that pivot point sensibly, I could probably go in here and just scale my contrast forward or back as needed and get the proper level of saturation that I'm looking for and have a pretty, I don't know, like I said, this is something I've been meaning to play with on my own time that I haven't, but just going through that little exploration and exercise right there, I like the level of control that I feel like I have in my hands for finessing that balance. And I like feeling like if I want to make a small nudge toward magenta, I can very easily do that now with my pivot. And it's not quite as like scary as just putting a hand on the trackball and being afraid that I'm going to bump things in the wrong direction. It's a more nuanced and more focused way of adjusting the image potentially. So that's one idea anyway for how you could operate on your A and B channels in LAB to create color separation. I hope you dig that. I think I do. I might try that on a project soon.
All right, question from Jim Robinson. He says, I've seen people push saturation into an image, then use offset to push the whole thing away from skin tone. It looks strange to me. What is making that technique not a viable option?
Yeah, man, I'm with you. It looks strange to me too. And here's what I think. Like, it's sort of like, how do we put this? Here, let's demo out what Jim is talking about just for the sake of example. Here's something that will happen all the time. This is actually something I have talked about before when you're like, okay, I'm working, let's say you're working through somewhat of a scenario like I pitched to you, where we do exposure, ratio, and then balance, and then you're doing sat over here, which I don't typically talk about as much, and there's a good reason for that. But for now, let's just say like you look at the image and you're like, all right, I want more saturation. You think that's what you want. You're convicted that that's what you want, and you start to saturate. What does that do? What's an easy way of characterizing what saturation will do? One thing it's going to do is exacerbate or exaggerate any imbalances in your image. That's the first thing it's going to do. That's why I've talked in the past here on the channel about before you even think about doing any saturation adjustment, make sure you got that image really well balanced, because if it's just a little bit off, it's going to be a lot bit off by the time you're done saturating the image. So if you don't take that advice and you say, no, let's crank it, I want saturation, you're thinking of saturation essentially as a primary correction, which you guys may have heard me say before. I don't actually think of saturation as a primary correction. Saturation has no analog in traditional like cinematic motion image mastering, and it's much more of a video technique, both in terms of the specific math that's used in Resolve, and in general, it is more of a secondary to me, or a faux secondary. But that's an uncommon POV. Most of us think of saturation as one of the first 3 or 4 things that we go for. Sometimes it's the first thing we go for. So what happens when that's the case, when that's our approach? Well, what happens is we crank it, and then we go, well, hell, that's not very balanced, is it? And then probably after the fact, we're going to go in and try to balance things out. And that can work fine. But I think to answer Jim's question, why is that not optimal? What makes that a problematic approach? I think it's really about the way you're sequencing your priorities. The balance of the image is what matters. And if you have a balanced image and you add saturation, you can evaluate the saturation from the context of like, well, I know the image is balanced already. So if the sat isn't looking good, your first thought, like if you've got a balanced image and you're saturating, let's just try it that way for a second. By the way, it's not that there's that much of a difference between doing one before or after the other. That's not going to make as much of a difference. It's more your frame of reference, your context, your concept for what you're doing. If you have a balanced image before you go in and you saturate, okay? And you go in and you saturate and you start to see that's not looking so hot. Like that doesn't look great to me anymore. Well, I already know the image is balanced. I've got some confidence there because I explicitly set my balance in a very intentional way before twisting this sat knob. So what's the first thing I'm likely to do when my sat knob starts to make the image look weird? I'm going to back off the saturation. Say, okay, I know I've gone too far. Let's back it off a little bit. If you haven't done that, if you don't have confidence in the underlying balance of your image, you are more likely to leave it here and say, oh, I'm now going to fix that saturation by balancing the image. And as Jim kind of alluded to, that can sort of work. Like this works decently well. But at the end of the day, what are you really doing here? You are compensating for a knob that you hit too hard. Does that make sense? So it looks better than it did before, but not as good. Let's just grab a still, as if you'd had a properly balanced image underneath and you let the saturation doing something nice be your guide to say, that's far enough, pal. Look at the difference. It's just slightly better here by my measure. It feels more natural. It feels more organic. Like this business back here, that's feeling really weird. Her like cheeks and certain areas of her face are starting to feel really odd. Whereas here, it feels a little more naturalistic. And that's even with me using the sat knob, which as you guys know is not my first choice. But even using that knob in both cases, you're getting a better scenario, a better outcome by balancing and then adding in saturation only while it looks good. And if it doesn't look good, instead of saying, what can I do to compensate for that? You say, okay, I must have gone too far, and you back it off. I hope that makes sense. That's a slippery thing to try to answer or characterize, but I do think that's what's driving that dynamic. And it is something that I've thought about a lot because it's like a very common workflow when we're color grading. We reach for saturation and we kind of put it on equal footing with our primaries. This is a great hands-on example of why, to me, saturation does not belong on equal footing with our primaries. Saturation is kind of a faux secondary.
Question from Camera Tim. In some instances where shadows are too noisy, would desaturating the shadow region and adding a color shift by using the luminance qualifier allow for a cleaner look or separation?
Oh, this is a fun question. So This question is one that I feel like sort of lives in the lore of color grading, that can really work if you have noisy shadows. Let's see, do I have a shot with noisy shadows? I don't have anything that's a super great example here. But I do know, I feel like this is worth going on a little mission to find. Hang tight. I have to switch my feed over because I don't know what kind of unsightly mess I'm going to find when I start going through media on my machine here. I'm just going to dig up a shot. I know right where it is, I promise. Anybody know any jokes while I wait for my hard drive to spin up? I guess in fairness to you, it's kind of tough to tell a joke in the chat, especially because you're listening to me in the future and I haven't gotten there yet. Okay, let's have a look here. So, oh, okay, one more place. I have a very specific shot in mind that we can audition this idea on. Got it. Okay, so let's pull this thing in here. And now I can show you guys my resolve again. Okay, so I've got this handful of shots that, if memory serves, are all fairly noisy. And the question is like, you know, if we're grading any of these images, let's go with this first one because it's quite noisy, and say like, all right, we've exposed up, and now we're wondering, I'm going to go kind of far just for the sake of this example here. And now what we're wondering is if we go in and we pull a loom qualifier and we desaturate the shadows, is that going to help? I'm just doing a straight up luminance qualifier, making sure I'm nice and soft. Drop that high end a little bit more. And then if we go in and drop our saturation, what does that do? Not much so far, maybe a little bit of like, it basically makes the noise monochrome along with everything else down there in that lower register of the image. And maybe if I sweep this a little bit higher, that's starting to help, but now the rest of the image is going monochrome. So I would say in the case of this specific image and in the case of that technique in general, that's one that I've heard a lot before and I've heard people talk about before. I have never had very much luck with that technique. Here's what I would do as an alternative to this. So if we say like right here is my best crack at doing that, which I would say really what I'm doing is just desaturating the image a little bit. Maybe I'm successfully kind of leaving the sky out of the bargain, but I'm certainly not leaving my subject unaffected. And as we know, the subject is, of course, the most important thing in our frame. So here's my best crack at, you know, like desat shadows. Okay. Now I want to show you another approach that we can take here. I've talked about this in different forms here on the channel. We'll see if it works here. It doesn't always, but I'm a big believer in doing what I like to call smearing the shadows, where I'm basically kind of rubbing code values together. So I've just pulled my DaVinci wide gamut mid-gray point, which is going to be a little bit high probably even for where I've got this image now. So I'm just going to drop that to taste. I'm going to create another control point here by option clicking somewhere down here. And now we're going to go up, followed by down. And this is indeed still too high. So I'm going to kind of like drop everything a little bit lower, like so. And try to get to where I feel like I'm not necessarily getting a contrast increase, but I'm getting a flatter, rounder shadow shape. It's not that easy to do by hand. I've actually got dedicated tools that I do this with, but that is my idea here, is to go in and try to kind of like round things out down in this area. like so. And maybe even, how could we do this here? What if I ungang and do this just on my luminance? Like that's getting kind of interesting to me as well. I have to say in this case, I actually think that the original question, the original suggestion does work a little bit better. It's a little bit less colorful, but it does seem to be tidying up that noise a little bit better. But that's something that I will play with sometimes with, usually with a dedicated tool that lets me like get a little bit more finessed with this. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm pushing low values within this very low luminance section. I'm pushing low values up and higher values down, meaning that there's less delta between them. I'm actually reducing the contrast in between them in order to try to minimize the apparent noise in this image. Like I said, I don't think that this is a particularly successful application of that technique yet, but that is something that I play around with and that I do have a lot of luck with when I have the time to go in there and really finesse it. And it's something you can play with, and actually kind of a great counterpoint to the concepts of separation and contrast that we're talking about today. There are all kinds of scenarios where controlling separation or contrast is actually about reducing the delta in order to make something less visually evident, less visually obvious, less legible to the viewer. In this case, that would be noise. So that would be, it's certainly a sound strategy to pursue and try to find a scenario where by reducing the delta of in between the noise and the rest of the image, you're making it less apparent. I wish that worked out live, but it doesn't happen every time.
Okay, question from Naveen. How is it that in movies like Joker, the colors, when viewed in the vectorscope, don't look too saturated, but perceptually they feel very saturated? Is it color separation? Is it desaturation of non-primaries?
Oh, I love this question. Yes, it is. It is 100% color separation. If you guys want to know where I get my inspiration from when it comes to a lot of the things that I talk about here on the channel and about with my craft in general, I get my inspiration from a few things that are relevant to that example. First of all, film. Film does an amazing job of this. Film naturally produces images with high color separation, but actually pretty low overall saturation. And that I think is like if I had to, part of this, like, how do I describe to you why the Joker looks and feels so good? There's lots of factors there. It's really well shot. It's really well graded by my friend Jill Bogdanowicz, one of the best colorists in the world. There's a look that she's grading underneath that was designed by her or built by her dad, Dr. Mitch Bogdanowicz, one of my mentors. So there's a lot going into the reproduction of into making those images look good. But they're grading specifically underneath a film emulation LUT that's designed to do what a film system would have done with that original scene if it had photographed it. And as a result, what you're getting is images where the separation is really high and low to medium saturations are quite strong, but then they really flatten off. So what you get as a result, like if I had to describe the taste of that dish to you, like, why do hamburgers taste good, for example? Like, well, it's something for me about, like, by the way, I can't remember the last time I ate a hamburger, but maybe I will after this. We're getting into food analogies, which means that I've really fallen into my stride, or that grade school is almost over and it's time to go eat some lunch after this or some snack. But if I had to describe to you, like, okay, why does a hamburger taste good? Well, a hamburger tastes good because of the contrast of the texture of the patty against the texture of the bun, and the contrast of like the umami of the patty and like the really like sharp acidic taste of like the pickles, at least in the case of my hamburger, because I'm definitely putting pickles in that hamburger, and the onions and the other sort of brighter flavors that are in there to offset the fatty umami flavor in the patty. Like there's sort of a contrast there. There's a push-pull there. I kind of feel that way about a really filmic image. It's like, wow, there's so much separation in there. It's so easy to read that image. It's so colorful, and yet it never feels garish, and it never blasts colors that are unpleasing to look at. And like, actually, literally the image we're on right now is a great example. High color separation down here, right? Not particularly pleasing, especially if I crank that sat even further. Like, you can call me a, like biased in my color grading practice. Pretty much like you could take this color of orange and this color of red away from me forever as a colorist. And I'm probably never going to come knocking and be like, I got to have that color for this project. I just never want to see that color. I don't think it's pleasing. Now look at what happens if we apply a film look to it. I'm going to use my Kodak 2383 for this. Like so. Look at that. The colors are actually more separated, but they're less garish. Like they're not popping as hard. And that becomes even more obvious with images that have more colors in them. I mean, this one's another example I love looking at. Like, look at the red of her mittens. It's getting deeper and on paper kind of like a little bit less colorful. And yet it's a more pleasing image. So that's what I think you're seeing when you look at an image like the ones in Joker, is you've got really good color separation, as you correctly intuited, paired with a soft and gentle and limited saturation ceiling. I mean, we talked about this recently here on the channel, I think. But when you pair those two things together, that's really what creates, to me, the signature taste, the signature sort of like dynamic, like interactive ingredients of a really good film look that, you see. It's kind of like that. To me, the fundamental dynamic in a hamburger is the burger with the pickle chips on there. If you don't have both sides of that coin, the burger's not really tasty anymore. Same with film. If you have really strong response in your color channels, but they're allowed to take off forever, you basically have a digital sensor. If you have really weak color response in your channels and they roll over, then you have a very boring monochrome image. It's the fact that those two things sort of interact and counteract each other that gives that unique flavor in a film image. I hope that makes any sense at all. I'm very passionate about this, but it's kind of difficult to talk about.
Well, you've made me hungry, so there's that.
I've succeeded at that.
All right. Christian is wondering, what's the best way to get color separation on a long form project like a feature that has a lot of setups? Do you change it on a clip level, or is it part of the show look?
Yeah, so great question to ask. And that's the question that I would say I'm kind of like asking on a recurring basis during a long form project like that. I think it's a matter of giving yourself every opportunity that you can and hoping, again, I mentioned this at the beginning of our hour today. You've got sort of like two things that are going to happen. Lots of opportunities for color separation are going to come at you over the course of a grade. Every shot is going to present unique opportunities for color separation. Every project is going to present unique opportunities for color separation. Some of those, you're going to be paying good enough attention. You're going to be astute enough to go, hey, that's an opportunity. And some of those you are going to successfully exploit to introduce better color separation. So it's really a question of like upping those numbers on all sides. Find more opportunities and convert more opportunities for color separation. And there's a continuum of those opportunities. We talked about this in the video. The first one, absolutely. Macro level look. You can introduce more color separation into every single shot in your project just by selecting and applying a good macro level look. So yes, first line of defense for sure. That's going to be one of the first things you do in your project anyway. So you should select a look that is helping you drive that agenda of introducing color separation. And then from there, it comes down to looking at individual scenes and individual shots within those scenes to go, what do I see here? What could I do? Is there an accent that I could embolden? Is there a non-optimized balance that I could sweeten and in doing so create color separation? That's probably your next stop when it comes to individual shots, is just optimizing that balance wheel, or that balance trackball, I should say, to get you best color separation every single time. I mean, again, we looked at that in this week's video. If you do nothing else but pick a good look and really balance each shot with that intention, you're going to get really good color separation in general. At least you are going to be able to leverage the opportunities that you are smart enough to spot on you're going to be able to leverage those on a consistent basis. So that would be kind of how I would think about it. Color separation, we're going to find opportunities for it throughout a color grade. If you pay attention and you look for them and you know to look for them, and then you have some strategies for how to exploit them, then there's more opportunity for color separation than we need. We just have to pay attention and take advantage of it.
Question from Gabriel. What are your thoughts on using chromatic adaptation and its various color models to achieve color separation over other options like linear gain?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll put it to you this way. I will typically use chromatic adaptation in a highly technical context. I'll give you an example. We've done this here on the channel before. If I have a shot that is clearly, this is something that happens all the time. I have a shot and someone shot a scene with available light in a subway car, for example. So I know that that camera doesn't have more than likely, their camera doesn't have a setting for fluorescent light. It might, but cameras often don't. And even if they do, sometimes that's not the rating that a cinematographer will use. Camera is going to be rated for tungsten probably, or for daylight, but the light source was actually fluorescent in nature. That's an example of where I would use chromatic adaptation to try to find an F preset. If you've ever looked here at your chromatic adaptation, you can see when you look under your standard illuminance, you've got all these F presets. These stand for fluorescent. And I'll go through the highly scientific exercise of setting a target of D65 and a source illuminant of F1 and then F2. And I'll literally just flip through these and look at what gives me the best result. That's the kind of context where I will use chromatic adaptations. Like, I know there's a technical mismatch happening here, and that if I can find it, then it's going to be the best solution and I can easily ripple it across all my shots. That's usually where I'll use chromatic adaptation. If it's creative, if it's about creating separation, this is a theme that I've talked about a bunch this year, I think, as well, but something that has renewed its self to me in my color grading practice this year has been like, at the end of the day, everything is red, green, blue in and red, green, blue out. We have camera sensors that have red, green, and blue sensitivity, and we have displays that have red, green, and blue emitters. So that's really the nature of our images as of today. That may change in the future, but that's the nature of our images as of today. So working with red, green, and blue is a very sensible way to intervene in that process, right? So that's a long way of saying, if I'm trying to max out color separation of an image that was captured in RGB and is going to RGB, and I'm trying to feel my way to an optimal position, changing the relative amounts of red, green, and blue in that image using linear gain or log offset is a very sensible, very intuitive way of going about that, especially because it's connected to a physical, like dialer or, like manipulator here on my control surface. And it allows me to do it that way. Because at the end of the day, like, that's all that matters. If I'm trying to create the best color separation, what's my criteria for that? It's me. When I think the colors look most separated. Yeah, I can kind of peek down at the vectorscope and confirm that I'm doing the right thing, but it's really just me and my clients deciding, yeah, that looks great, or no, that looks terrible. So if I have the perfect chromatic adaptation parameters, but they don't do that, who cares? And conversely, if I have chromatic adaptation parameters that are dead wrong, but they do that, that's fair play as well. But at that point, I would rather be on my trackballs than on little tiny knobs inside of an OFX plugin if what I'm doing is essentially freehanding to get a best visual result anyway. So I hope that's a helpful idea there. I've gone back and forth on that a lot. That's the same fundamental reason why I've moved off of like temperature and tint, for example. Like, I don't really have much faith in the accuracy of those, or that accuracy is what I need most of the time when I'm adjusting temperature and tint. Most of the time, I'm just trying to feel my way to a good result within a well-designed system. And that's why I've ended up moving so much of my stock methodology in color grading back to good old RGB, either log offset or linear gain. And we can take, let's do one more.
All right. This one's from Jim Robinson, wondering how much do you go back and reanalyze things and tools that you don't use much? For example, using the color warper for things like color separation.
Not that often, to be honest with you. Many of you guys know this about me, but like, I have a strength and a weakness in my practice in that I really need to understand something to feel comfortable using it. I really need to understand it, and I need to believe. I need to understand what it's doing and believe that what it's doing is ideal. Those are tough criteria to hit. Coming to an understanding can be hard, and then coming to believe that is the best way to go about that can take time and be a difficult bar to hit. So that means that, like, if that test gets failed inside of Resolve, it's kind of failed for me. And it's also the reason why I am more likely in my downtime when I'm just, putting in reps, putting in practice. I'm far more likely for me in my sort of dual color grading color science practice to go, what if I manipulated my image, the math of my pixels in this way? Would I get an interesting result from that? What if I applied this concept or that concept? So I'm more inclined to tinker and refine and improve my tools or revisit ideas that maybe I kicked around and didn't do anything with than I am to go, maybe I've been given the color warper too hard of a time. Usually when I shut the door for good, which I'm not saying is necessarily a virtue, but that is my honest answer. Is I kind of like, I put tools into their buckets, and once they're in a bucket, they typically will stay there. But that's neither good nor bad. That's just my particular practice, and I think it's a great idea. I should probably revisit things more, because on the rare occasions that I do, you never know. Sometimes you find something interesting or inspirational that you used to think was boring or suboptimal. I mean, what we were just talking about a minute ago is a great example. There was a time for, 18 months where I was like, it's only temperature and tint. It has to be temperature and tint in the HDR zones palette. Balance, RGB offset is dead to me. RGB gain is dead to me. It's impure. It's wrong. It's too subjective and touchy-feely. It's all about temperature and tint. And then I changed my tune after a while because I didn't like what I was getting with temperature and tint. So I guess it's not entirely true to say that I never move off of things, but I guess I'm stubborn is the easy way to put that. Anyway, that was a really good session, guys. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for your questions. Thanks for your passion and your energy. I always love spending this hour with you guys on Friday morning. By the way, for those of you guys, actually put your hand up. Let me know loud and clear. Do I have anybody who either has done the Colorist Career Accelerator in the past or will be joining for the Colorist Career Accelerator next week? Anybody in the house who fits that category? Let me know. Gadali, are you going to come?
Yeah, I'm going to be there.
Gadali's going to be there. It's going to be a party. We're so excited about it, guys. This course, for those of you guys who don't know, it's a course that we've now run a couple times. This will be our fourth round running it. It's a 4-day intensive workshop that is designed to give you everything that you need to launch or to, relaunch your ideal color grading business to make great money doing great work as a professional colorist. It's one of my favorite highlights of the year when I teach this course and I get to hang out with Gadali and 200 really excited emerging and talented colorists. So super excited about that. So for my past CCA alums, huge high five. For those of you guys who are going to be joining next week, also huge high five. We sold out the course last week and really excited to have another great round of CCA. That also means that we will not be having grade school next week because we are going to be in the trenches of the Colorist Career Accelerator and getting in there and learning how to be our best, most billable and, ideal professional colorists for those of you guys who are going to be joining. So for those who will be there, I'm really excited to see you. For the rest of you guys, we will be back the following week with fresh excitement and passion from CCA. And so that's the game plan for next week. We'll still have a video next week, but no grade school because we'll be doing CCA. So for those who are going to be there, really excited. I will see you there. For everybody else, I will see you 2 weeks from today for our next grade school. And of course, for our usual pre-recorded videos. You guys are awesome. Thank you very much. Have a great Friday. Have a great weekend. And I will see you very soon.